welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm here with friend of the show, Doug Greene, and we are talking about your book, Stalin and the Dialectics of Saturn, which has an intriguing name, actually. So, it's going to start out. Why another Stalin book?
Well, why another Stalin book is, I don't think anyone tried the approach that I did, which goes into the title and the setup. So the Dialectics of Saturn is actually, it comes from originally the French Revolution, where revolutions are like Saturn, they devour their children. Conservatives said that, revolutionaries like Danton said that. So there's constant comparisons of like the French and Russian revolutions as having the same fate. And also I use Marx's 18th Brumaire to kind of structure the book, where in one of the prefaces, Marx says there were like very broadly three approaches to the rise of Brumaire. One is like people who hated Louis Bonaparte and saw him as like this bolt from the blue, this kind of demon who just appeared from history, like Victor Hugo, and others like Proudhon, who kind of celebrated him as like this active historical necessity. And Marx differentiated himself from that by looking at, you know, the class struggle, the material basis that allowed someone like Bonaparte to rise. And obviously, you know, there's a long history of comparing, you know, Stalin and Bonaparte. So I kind of did that and just looked at Stalinism in the same way. So I looked very closely at anti-communists from across, you know, very reactionary ones from Hitler, Churchill, Koestler, the people who made up the Black Book of Communism. And I also, in terms of historical necessity, these are people who see Stalinism as like the way to reach communism. So it's partly looking at the debates between Koestler and Merleau-Ponty, the various figures of Western Marxism, Lukács, Gramsci, Althusser, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, etc. It's kind of interesting to situate all these people in those debates. And, you know, of course, I'm looking also at people like Trotsky, Isaac Deutscher, Victor Serge, etc. So I don't think anyone has tried to do that approach.
Well, I mean, one of the things I can say is, unfortunately, a lot of historiographic readings of Stalin, I say historiographic, not just history here, because it's a whole school of interpretation, is very rooted in either anti-communism or like left oppositions that were not Soviet defensists. Like a lot of, for example, a lot of people today will go after Trotskyism as a whole, as if Trotskyism was not in general Soviet defensist off of the actions of non-defensist Trotskyist groups. And these are the ones who get a lot of play in academia and whatnot for kind of obvious reasons until 1992 kind of opens everything up and people can be more honest. Yet it also seems like right now, I guess one of the reasons I was going to ask you about this is like, if you'd have told me in 2009, when I was approaching the Socialist Party of America, of the United States of America, the SPUSA, that we would be having debates about Stalin again in 2023, I would be very shocked. Why do you think? What about the anti-communist reading of Stalin and Stalinism leads to this inversion where people actually, you know, take a uncritical Grover Furr inspired view, and you know, I can go back and misread real scholars like Fitzpatrick or Geddes or whatnot, who are not, you know, are used as proof text. Well, what do you think is driving that?
I mean, in the current moment, I mean, there has been a resurgence in the last, you know, 10 plus years of interest in socialism, very broadly defined, very diffuse. And that, you know, brings up everything from, you know, Sweden to the Soviet Union to various forms of anarchism. So in that mix, yeah, Stalinism kind of comes up, and people who are interested in alternatives are going to look at that. And if you look at like the anti-communists, like, you know, the people who made up the Black Book of Communism, Solzhenitsyn, Richard Pipes, all of them, if you actually like read them, they're really not materialists. It's very moralistic. It's very almost religious at times, if not outright anti-Semitic, depending on who we're talking about. And if you're willing to like challenge that, then you're going to look for alternatives. And yeah, it can lead people to just go whole hog and say, you know what, they're all completely lying to us about this. And they are, let's be clear. So let's just embrace, you know, this Grover Fur type style approach, which, you know, segments of the left have done. And, you know, it's an understandable but wrong approach to things. We shouldn't ever do something like that. But and I think both the positions of like the kind of both from the blue and the historical necessity approach to Stalinism, they share the same kind of fatalistic teleology that, you know, Stalinism is inevitable result of communism. In the case of the anti-communists, they think it's horrible. It leads to hell and godlessness. And the Grover Fur, the neo-Stalinists think it's, you know, great. You know, we were lied to. It's actually a good thing. So there is actually a certain unity of opposites to quote Mao on that.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting about the current moment when we talk about this, and we can turn about some of the specifics that come up in your book, but I do sort of find it interesting that this is happening when both traditional Maoism, and I'm going to actually define traditional Maoism. Either Mao Zedong thought or Marxist-Leninist Maoism, which are different traditions. They're both really born out of the late 1970s, early 1980s. But the reason why I call them traditional is like they had a really hard time with both China as it currently exists and the USSR because of the Sino-Soviet split. And they had critiques of Stalin while also trying to maintain anti-revisionism, which was a very kind of weird position to be in. I remember like reading Kasama Project back in the day. You may remember when those guys were still around in the late early teens. And a lot of those guys were like, well, we do have a critique of Stalin and Stalinism, but, you know, we can't go with the Trotskyists because we're anti-revisionist and we have to support the historical USSR. And then we're just not going to talk about the Sino-Soviet split. We're just going to pretend that never happened. Or that Khrushchev was all wrong or whatever. What do you think? I think it's interesting because that style of Maoism is pretty much gone.
Yeah.
And concurrently, Trotskyism is also pretty much gone. I mean, there are still Trotskyists, arguably, and I'm going to argue this on another episode, the entirety of the current American sectarian left is actually descendants of Trotskyist groups, even the ones that are anti-revisionist Stalinist. But with the exception of the CPUSA, that's literally it. Because if you consider like the Shachtman split and the SPA also to be a result of a weird Trotsky move, then everybody it comes out of Trotskyist stuff. Do you think that those? What do you think that those traditions have lost in this response to anti-communism, since anti-communism? Like, because it does seem like in general, Trotskyism's organizational capacity and like non-Dungist Maoism's organizational capacity has just been wiped out.
I mean, it's kind of interesting in terms of like, you know, Maoism or Mao Zedong thought is, you know, obviously they were very dominant on the far left in the 70s. And even outside the US, they're actually, you know, still pretty prominent right now in places like the Philippines or India. But in terms of, and it's interesting, like, because Mao is not quite like Hoxha. Hoxha actually says at one point, Stalin does nothing wrong. And it's clear if you actually read Mao, he's like, you know, there's this 70% of Stalin he upholds, and then there's this 30% that he doesn't. So on the one hand, it's like they condemn the purges for going too far and say, you know, Stalin wasn't that great with the Chinese Revolution, which is, you know, kind of an understatement there.
Yeah, but understatement. It's people think that the Sino-Soviet split starts with Khrushchev. Like the Sino-Soviet split starts with Stalin sending Mering to the Kuomintang.
Yeah,
like so and it goes all the way back.
Like Mao never criticized Stalin while he was alive, but even after he died, he did say, you know, that stuff in the 20s was a really bad mistake. But the thing is, you know, the Maoist critique of Stalin, it really doesn't get into like the nitty gritty, the historical details, at least not from Mao and the Chinese. And it's really people abroad who try and like fill in the gaps. So you see like various efforts, like in the US, you have like the RCP's Red Papers that tries to explain like how capitalism was restored in the Soviet Union. But it ends up largely defending like, you know, the Stalin and other purge trials. You have a more serious effort in France with people like Charles Bettelheim, I think, who really does try and actually analyze the Soviet Union. I think a lot of it's wrong, but I actually think it's a very serious effort. And there's people obviously like Samir Amin, etc., but they never seem to be quite the dominant strain in either Maoism or Mao Zedong thought. It ends up, you know, if you ascribe to, you know, we're going to get a little obscure, you know, the revolutionary internationalist movement, they basically just take Mao whole hog, and there's really not super much, you know, that they add to it. It's still their verdicts on like the Soviet purges could, you know, have been reprinted from the 30s, etc. So I don't really think they deal with a lot of the historiography. And in terms of, you know, the Trotskyists left, I think a lot of Trotskyists do themselves a disservice by not looking at a lot of the scholarship, because I don't think Trotsky himself, I mean, I agree, Trotsky is for critical defense of the Soviet Union. He is, you know, that's why the split with Shachtman happens, you know, pretty much. And there is all this valuable historical literature, you know, from Getty, from Fitzpatrick, and, you know, other people. And it's worth checking out, because if you're like in that sectarian mindset, you really are kind of cutting yourself off from like a lot of valuable scholarship. And it's to our detriment as Marxists to do that, basically.
Yeah, one of the things that I can say is my opinions on Stalin have nuanced quite a bit, but nuance does not mean like
I know exactly what you mean.
recuperation. And I've been somewhat, you know, I have some smarter friends on the left who have been more sympathetic to Stalin apologia. And what I actually tend to get from them is like, well, we can't lose the Soviet Union. And then I'm like, but the secret speech is from the Soviet Union. Like, you're actually even arguing against Soviet doctrine in some cases. I guess because you side with the Chinese and the Sino-Soviet split, but I actually don't think most people actually have thought that out, nor is it a live question today. So it's this tendency confuses me, and the best I could come up with is basically the gaslighting of years of right-wing anti-communism had just left people very open to like any argument that seemed like it was kind of fair and overturning, you know, Richard Pipe's historiography, which is, you're right, is like, I remember thinking, for example, for years when I was educated on the Soviet Union, and I was a right-winger back then, and this was over 20 years ago, but like I was like almost taught that Kirov was basically murdered by Stalin, which is just not true. There's not that much evidence to support anything like that. Like,
when you look at Stalin as like, you know, this is what the anti-communists do, is he's a demon. He's this all, you know, basically all-knowing totalitarian leader, you know, who kills Kirov, who does this, who makes a famine in the Ukraine. And I don't want to defend Stalin's actions in the Ukraine or in the purges, but it's not true that he like caused a famine. I think like a lot of the Holodomor like discourse is basically from these right-wing Ukrainian emigres, and it's not supported by current scholarship. if you look at the revisionist school on Soviet historiography, all of them reject like the Robert Conquest school. And you're right, there is no proof that Stalin orchestrated the purges as some kind of master plan. The best evidence we have, it was just kind of some random act that he took advantage of. And, you know, there was some ad hoc stuff going on, but it wasn't part of some master plan. And that's part of the problem with the anti-communists. They think history is so well controlled that there can be no accidents, and Stalin is this grand puppet master, which just isn't true.
Right. And they also like equate the whatever tragedies you think in the Great Leap Forward happened and any excesses of the Cultural Revolution to Stalinism. And as I've pointed out, like, nobody was actually in charge of the Cultural Revolution. Like, I mean, you know, there were forces unleashed by that no one could control. And I think that's also kind of true with the purges. However, we do have plenty of evidence that the consolidation against the old Bolsheviks and all that was more than just a purging of bureaucracy or a purging of fifth columnists. There's no way that was true. Like, and the other argument that I often hear is one of the weirder ones about, like, for example, the purging of Bukharin is Stalin knew that they were going to have to fight the Nazis real fast, so they had to industrialize real fast, blah, blah, blah. There is some scholarship that uses this kind of to justify ending the NEP and dekulagization, even though I think dekulagization is a result of the way the NEP is ended. And I've always found it very interesting to just go, you know, like, we have to have a much more complicated view on what happened. It's not just a matter of like, oh, if somebody else would have been in here, all this would not have happened. I don't think that's the case in Ukraine. I don't think that's the case with collectivization. But I'm also not going to defend Yusufzhina and Beria ever. Like, that's not a defensible position. You know, I'm not going to pretend like the Cotton Massacre didn't happen. You know, like, it's just, and the only arguments I've ever seen from it, even from someone like Grover Furr, they're arguments from like holes in the records. Like, they're not even positive arguments. They're like, well, since we don't have this record of how much this happened and we were missing this record, this just didn't happen at all. You know, we can make a positive case from that from a lack of evidence, which is, you know, just bad thinking. I mean, it is a good Stalin of the gaps.
That's a great phrase.
Argument. But I do think one of the things I'm liking about your approach here is, like, we do have to deal with the influence of right-wing anti-communism and our inability to grapple with this. Like, that has to be dialectically considered. So one of the things that's interesting, I mean, you mentioned the right-wing anti-communists. Koestler is an interesting figure for me, because I'm never quite sure if I put him on the right or not. I'm always like looking at him and going,
He is, I mean, he is a fascinating figure. You know, the German Communist Party splits over the Spanish Civil War and the purges, and he writes his famous book, Darkness at Noon, which I actually kind of make the centerpiece when I'm dealing with actually the Western Marxists and Stalinism. Is he makes probably one of the better arguments for historical necessity when, you know, and obviously the plot of Darkness at Noon is an old Bolshevik, is in prison, and he comes around to confess for the good of the party, for the good of the revolution, even if it destroys his reputation, because it's for the necessity of history to reach communism. And even though Koestler rejects, he thinks that leads to totalitarianism and everything, but he makes a very compelling case for that. And he kind of shifts, you know, from initially when he joins like the Comintern, he believes in that historical necessity and accepts Stalinism. By 1950, he's accepted historical necessity. He just thinks it's on the side of the United States and the CIA, because he's one of the people behind the Congress of Cultural Freedom, etc. And later on in life, he ends up going in a very bizarre direction. He actually drops out of a lot of these active anti-communists. He ends up getting involved in weird stuff with like ESP and race science, etc. But he's actually a very fascinating figure. And I actually, you know, whatever else I can say about his politics, like Darkness at Noon was actually like an excellent book.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting, actually, when you part about this necessity school, is they actually, what they do that is so interesting to me is that they basically, how do I say this? Take the smarter Stalinist own argument, or Marxist Leninist, because they don't like being called what they are. Smarter Marxist Leninist arguments and like invert them. Like, oh yeah, it is historically necessity. It was always going to end badly. Like, you're right. You had to do what you had to do. Because that, I remember when I used to, way back when I was first encountering this, and I'd be asked, well, why did this happen? Like, well, it wasn't, we had to do it. Like, collectivization had to be this way. We had to beat the Nazis. And I was like, well, what explains the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? We had to stall. And I'm like, then why were you flat-footed with an invasion of Stalingrad? Really seemed to surprise Stalin. You know, like, you know, I'm not one of the people who, I've heard arguments on both Stalin as a good war leader by serious scholars, and Stalin as a terrible war leader by also serious scholars. And I actually know, like for example, Donald Parkinson over at Cosmonaut is on Team Stalin bad, but he was actually a good war leader. I actually can't. I've looked at both sides of the evidence, and I'm like, I don't know. This is really close, but I just do not believe that and there's no documentary evidence that he had like a plan to build up forces the way he did to fight Hitler, while also siding with Hitler and Stalin, and I guess laying Stalingrad out as a I can't actually make that work in my head.
No, I don't think Stalin was a great war leader. And, you know, it's complicated because the fact is the Soviet Union wins the war and Stalin's name is connected with that. So you kind of have to deal with that. I mean, the fact is, you know, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact does not actually buy the Soviet Union much time. And partly, you know, because Hitler wins so quickly against France and the Western European powers, but also the fact that Stalin willfully ignores intelligence, has troops out of position, and had purged some of the best commanders before the war. And, you know, they're lucky that they survived some of those initial engagements. And what I think Stalin does do is he kind of loosens up enough that he lets his generals have a bit more influence and say. And this is something you can find in American historians of the Red Army, people like David Glantz. Whereas as the war goes on, it's kind of like Hitler and Stalin kind of shift roles, where Hitler becomes much more of a micromanager and like really stymies the generals, whereas Stalin, you know, kind of steps back and learns enough to like let people like Zhukov do their jobs. But I don't think he was this great war commander. And you're right, there is kind of some division on that. People like Jeffrey Roberts or Isaac Deutsch are actually very praiseworthy of Stalin's military acumen, but others are not quite so much, like Dmitry Bulganov, and there are others as well. But I'm kind of not on the team of Stalin as a good war leader, because it does undermine this whole historical necessity approach. Because if it was all necessary, why were you purging your best commanders? Why were you, you know, kind of appeasing the Nazis, also giving them so much raw material that allowed them to invade the Soviet Union? If you actually look at those figures, you know, the Nazis made up very well from the trade deals between 1939 and 1941. And I think it really undermines the historical necessitarian approach. But, you know, all this is to say, you know, I may be glad the Soviet Union, I am glad the Soviet Union won the war, but I think Stalin's leadership made it much more difficult than it should have been.
Yeah, I think I think that's actually a key thing to actually kind of parse is, why is it there's been a hard time constructing a narrative that wasn't cartoonish on Stalin. I mean, because one of the things I get very frustrated with, and I say this like, I am not, neither one of us are particularly Stalin apologetic. I'm also pretty critical of historical Maoism. I think the Sino-Soviet is both unforgivable. I don't completely buy the arguments that they're like the deaths in the Great Leap Forward were as low as someone like Han Dongping says, but I also don't buy the upper end number because the stats just don't seem to bear that out either. But the Stalin apologia is interesting to me because one of the things that I've noticed is there's also this inability now for people to understand Stalin's positions in different periods. Like you have people who are quoting to me the 1951 text about the new economic problems in the Soviet Union, but also maintaining 1934 third periodism. And I'm like, these aren't even like, I know it doesn't seem obvious, but these are not positions that you can hold at the same time. Like, and so one of the things about anti-Stalinism, because it makes it all about a man, and unfortunately, I think anti-revisionism does too. Like, because what's at stake in anti-revisionism is the reputation of a figure. So when you have that happening, it becomes very hard to point out, like, these positions shift. Stalin's positions radically shift between 1939 and 1951. Like, and they're not just about his personality or his, you know, evil machinations or whatever. And I will say the books that made me really understand this are not even written by somebody who's like particularly pro Stalin. I mean, it's Joel Kotkin's really good, but 2 of the 3 volumes of which we have of Stalin's biography that make it pretty clear this is a much more complicated scenario, but that the Bonapartist reading by Trotsky is not really off, right? Like that this actually has a certain character to it. And this character is like the incoherence of the class arrangement of the Soviet Union post 19. I mean, probably actually goes all the way back to the Civil War, but post that time period, which you know, Lenin and early Stalin actually managed to push off. But so, what's your take on that? Like, do you is that just anti-communism? Is it anti-revisionism? Is it you can't reduce it to one or the other? Like, why can we not have this like dialogue about Stalin as a Bonapartist figure, but not Stalin as like evil machinator who doesn't really believe in it, or as totally historically necessary and either A, it had to happen because communism, which I also think is a hard argument to make post 1992, or B, it had to happen because communism, but communism bad. Like, you know, so how do we get out of that cul-de-sac?
I mean, I think part of it is, I mean, one thing that was interesting to me doing the research is when I reread Trotsky's biography of Stalin, and one thing he actually says in that at one point is that if Stalin in the 1920s had seen where his fight with the opposition would lead in 10 years, he would have been horrified. So pretty much even Trotsky, who had pretty good reason to not like Stalin, is saying, listen, this is not some kind of diabolical figure, but is actually someone who really didn't have like the breadth of vision to understand like where things would lead. He thought he was generally doing the right thing for the revolution. It's obviously, as Marxists, we know what you say is not necessarily what happens, what you do. And I think looking at Stalin as this kind of cartoonish figure, you could say the same about Mao as well, really doesn't actually help us understand things. If you were to read a book like Mao, The Unknown Story, it's a cartoon villain basically there. And that's like a lot of what the discussion of Stalin is. And it doesn't help us understand anything. It just views these people as just demons, etc. But
Yeah.
if you clear away all that kind of anti-communist rubbish, which it does take a lot of work, and you kind of look at materially the class struggle, all these wider factors, the imperialist encirclement, etc., you can kind of see the environment in which these people move and they make decisions and the structures they have to operate in. So one thing my book is not is a biography of Stalin. And it's trying to look more at the ism as opposed to the man, although obviously the man is important as well. And I have a lot of issues with Kotkin's work on Stalin. I think especially the first volume is very anti-communist. But he does do an interesting job in the second of looking at things like the purges and a lot of the geopolitics, etc., which I thought was kind of interesting. And if we're serious about developing a Marxist approach to the Soviet Union or Maoist China or what have you, it does mean looking at not just the environment in which these people move, etc., but the fact is, at least in the Soviet Union, there were alternatives. It wasn't historically necessary that Stalin was going to, come out on top. Trotsky had his program, and it's not just, Trotsky good, Stalin bad. There's a whole slew of proposals that he has on everything from industrialization to the Soviets to collective farms, etc. And, if you want to go that route, you could argue Bukharin. But I think also looking at the various concrete alternatives that did exist kind of shows you, listen, there were alternative paths, which for whatever reason did not get chosen. And you could say the same about China. There were various attempts, at one point, I think after the Great Leap Forward, Mao was kind of forced to go in the background. And maybe Liu Shaoxi would have been better. Who knows? But there were alternatives on hand. And it's kind of, looking at both the material circumstances, trying to scrape away all the anti-communist rubbish that we hear about all this. And then looking at, the alternatives that were offered and etc. For whatever reason, they may not have gotten chosen, but they did exist. And it does us a disservice as historians and Marxists to kind of ignore those alternatives. And that's kind of what the book is also kind of arguing. It's this is not necessarily inevitable with socialism. There are alternatives. Stalinism is not the historical destiny. And we should understand that future socialism doesn't have to be Stalinist.
Well, I mean, even early on, like Chinduzu and Li Dozhao. I mean, there's options in the Chinese Communist Party. There are less options in the Bolsheviks pre-Lenin. I guess arguably you could argue about Bogdanov, but not that I don't like and respect Bogdanov, but I don't know that he would have been the same kind of leader. But there are multiple ways. I mean, there's not even just one left and right opposition to Stalin. That's another thing that I was like I don't like Zinovievism, but it was a possibility. Radic existed. I mean, one of the things you have to deal with the loss of the old Bolsheviks is basically you had the eradication of most of the possibilities because you eradicated most of the thinkers. And I don't argue that the purges are bad just because it took out the old Bolsheviks, because that has a very myopic view of the Russian people and the Soviet peoples. But it does seem like there was a strategic elimination of alternate views. And I am of the opinion personally, for example, and this you can't lay on Stalin, but the faction ban after 1921 being maintained after the end of the war was a fundamental mistake. I know that's somewhat controversial amongst all Marx Leninists, but I do see it as setting up this all or nothing criteria in which, whichever faction was going to win was probably going to be the faction that was willing to play the hardest, and by hardest I mean nastiest. So Yeah, take with that what you will. But yeah, there's multiple possibilities. And one of the things when it comes to China, there's multiple Maos. Like that's one of the interesting things about like Maoism in particular. When I meet a Maoist, either a Mao Zedong thoughtist or an MLM third worldist, I'm like, what period Mao will pulling from here? Because like there's radically different ideas at different periods, and like Mao was pretty open about changing his mind. Actually, is one of the things I kind of respect about him. You know, going like this did not work, and like I said, this is kind of true with Stalin, but not to the same extent. Like that's why it's so hard to even figure out what Stalinism is. Like, is it pro-market concessions or anti-market concessions? Is it value abolitionist or value eternally? Like, I bring those up because just in economic questions, those are questions in which Stalin takes opposing views in his lifetime. Actually, the only thing he's fairly consistent on, and even this he's not totally consistent on, is his answer to the national question. And that kind of makes sense because that was what he was a specialist on before he became a major party leader. But anyway.
Well, it is kind of interesting. I mean, the purges, you know, they do wipe out, you know, I don't argue the purges are so much against the old Bolsheviks as opposed to more its potential opposition, which obviously there's a lot of overlap with the old Bolsheviks. But there's some who survive. People like Molotov is an old Bolshevik, and he lives to 1986. And Deutscher actually makes the argument because of the purges, the only way you could have de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union was not from below. It had to happen from above. It had to happen from within the party, and it fell to someone like Khrushchev. And, you know, he obviously did kind of a very half-hearted, tepid way to do that as well. And you're right, you know, in terms of Stalinism, even whether it's pro-market or, you know, ultra-planned economy, even within like the people who really defend Stalin, like Domenico Lacerda, who's part of the appendix of the book, he actually is very pro-market. He's more a Dengist than a Stalinist, I'd argue, but he likes the rule of law, he likes markets, etc. Grover Furr, who was friends with Lacerda, he is abolish markets right away, just go straight to communism, etc. So this is they're both very pro-Stalin. Purges are good, but one is pro-market, one is very anti-market.
Yeah, I've actually heard people point out that, like, from a classical Marxist-Leninist perspective, Grover Furr would almost be considered an ultra-leftist. So which is funny, but and the history of the organization he's in is actually very odd. It's an odd man out group, even for pro-Stalin groups. Like, it's a pretty strange one.
Right. I think he's either in or close to Progressive
right.
Labor, which I've heard them describe as like Trotskyist with a lobotomy, which is kind of funny.
Well, this does bring us to another weird thing of our period in specific, which is American Marxism becoming anti-revisionism to the point that, like, it literally adopts Soviet curriculum from the 1930s as part of its training program. And hides its own origins, even though they still claim Sam Marcy. They hide that Sam Marcy considers himself a Trotskyist the entirety of his life. So, like, that's wild to me, but that's where it is. I mean, one of the interesting things about the United States is, like, I guess you have a Hojist party that's actually really new. Started in 2008. The American Labor Party.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, and then there's like the Progressive Labor Party, and they're hard to pin down. And then there's the RCP of Basics fame, above vacuum fame. Although people don't tend to forget, he did not actually found that party. And then there's the CPUSA, which is a historical, you know, Marxist-Leninist party of the United States. It's been pulling the Popular Front even after the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but whatever. That's its orientation. interestingly, a lot of the anti-revisionist parties now do not have any historical tie to any Marxist-Leninist group, which is kind of strange. What do you think that's about?
I think it's partly just because there's very little to like for them to latch on to. When there was the Soviet Union, whether good or bad, you kind of like had to make a decision like where you stand on it and if you're going to ally with it. It's like Marcy obviously kind of broke away from the SWP when there was still a Soviet Union, over Hungary. And he just adopted the position, let's just defend it. The class struggle is basically got subsumed to the struggle between the different blocks. And that got transformed after the USSR fell to anyone who was anti-American, basically. And it's just interesting, even among the various Marxist-Leninists, like a lot of the Hojists I know, for instance, are not pro-Russia. They do not defend like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They consider Russia imperialist. But I know others who are Marxist-Leninists, some other Marcyites who, they think Russia is some kind of progressive anti-imperialist force. As far as I know, the RCP doesn't, defend the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whatever else. I don't even think the CPUSA does either. So even within them, there's like a very interesting diversity. And I think it's partly just them reacting. There's really no state that they can just kind of look to. I mean, some obviously do look to China, but China, even less than the USSR, doesn't really do anything like in terms of promoting internationalism anymore.
Well, I think this is interesting because, there's been this increasing drip of multipolarity talk, which I would love to believe people got from English geopolitical strategy from the early 20th century, or even Fareed Zakaria, but I don't really believe that. I also think that there's been a touting of multipolarity as a good in and of itself. Now, I actually don't have a strong opinion on multipolarity any more than I have a strong opinion on thunderstorms. Like, this seems to be a development of capitalist polities that's beyond any one power's control, even. And it would be good for a rising power such as China to leverage that, right? But somehow that's become a talking point as if that is like the same as having even a socialist transitionary government, which is a very weird thing. And it's not the kind of thing actually that Marxist-Leninists would have upheld, in the past. So I think there's something to the fact that Stalin, ironically, right now is like an empty face. I actually don't know someone's politics by the fact that they tell me they're a Marxist-Leninist, not on any real geopolitical or even economic situation at the moment. Since there's no Soviet Union anymore, there's no, the CPC, doesn't really do, other than, generally pro-China agitprop kind of stays out of these questions. I have some friends who are paranoid who think some of this rebirth and Stalinism actually is tied to China, but I don't see any evidence for that.
No, I honestly don't. I mean, if you look at it like this, like the Soviet Union until close to the very end was still pumping out like Marxist literature, like those textbooks you're talking about. I have editions of that from like 1988, 89. I mean, aside from maybe Xi's works, does China like mass produce like Marxist literature?
No, you can still find regular Progress Press stuff from like 87, 88, 89, 90. Interesting collection. I mean, like, I think I have some in here actually, of like stuff that was printed in my lifetime. And that was when the Soviet Union was not doing well, but they were still getting stuff into the United States, as agitprop or whatever. Foreign language press, I think, is the Chinese equivalent of that, and it doesn't do anything like that kind of keeping stuff in print. I think they do some, but not to the same level at all, and It's usually about Mao. So
Interesting. This is a side remark, but there is a current day Maoist publisher of the same name who's retaken that. Just, I think it's kind of a snub to the Chinese, and they're putting out like all this anti-revisionist literature and republishing, the Marxist classics. I actually think they do a good job in their production value. I order from them quite frequently.
Yeah.
But I was also going to say, in terms of multipolarity, to me, I've joked before. It's like, Palpatine on the phone and Robot Chicken. What the hell is multipolarity? It just seems like this kind of empty signifier. It seems like, discount geopolitics. Like, I guess if you're like the leader of some developing country, yeah, you might want that. But it's not like a socialist project to me to want to have for Russia to become like a full-blown imperialist power on par with the United States or something. I don't think that's like really a good thing. And even when like the various communist parties were making like some horrendous compromises back in like, the 60s or the 70s, in various third world countries, is because those countries were aligned to the Soviet Union or potentially could be. It wasn't, for its own sake to like have some nebulous concept like multipolarity. I also just think whenever I've seen the multipolarity stuff, it just tends to be tied to some kind of apologeta for Putin and Russia, and is not very well defined to me.
Yeah, there does seem to be some of it tied to actually Chinese interests. I think Ben Norton's pretty clearly on the China side of things, but that language was not ubiquitous on the left until the Russia-Ukraine war. And that language priorly was associated with either Fareed Zakaria in the United States, or it was associated with Alexander Dugin. And actually his using British polar theory from the early 20th century in international relations as some kind of more meaningful shift. I find it interesting because, like, as a descriptor of what happens when one hegemon, becomes a regional hegemon from being a world hegemon, like, it's fair enough, but that's just like, that doesn't say anything to me about socialism. It doesn't even say anything about capitalist imperialism. It just says something about who's in charge of it. So that is a completely different sort of framework. And for people to have picked it up kind of opportunistically without realizing its origins, I mean, we'll get back to your book because I do want to talk about the anti-communist stuff and some of the misleading things. And I think we both are betraying that. My two favorite writers on Stalin who are properly speaking Marxist and not just scholars. My favorite writer on Stalin who's a scholar is Fitzpatrick. But tend to be Deutscher and, to a lesser degree, Hillel Ticktin. Although Ticktin, I think, takes too much of a moralistic view of Stalin. That's neither here nor there. But I do want to deal with the fact that, like, when we approach Stalinism now, like I said, he feels empty because what I see in, quote, Marxist-Leninist, we can't, like I said earlier, you can't predict what someone's stances are going to be. If they're pro-market or anti-market, is they're pro-Russia or anti-Russia, are third campus. I'm sure there's all those positions within Marxist-Leninist organizations now. Whether or not they're popular frontist or abstentionist, I can't predict off of it anymore. It's actually quite funny. A lot of people I know who call themselves MLs actually take a united frontist position, which I find kind of hilarious. But it seems like an empty gesture in a lot of ways. And because so many people pull from so many different other ideologies to make it have a whole lot to say today. Like, we can, I think a big divide is like, what you might call woke Marxist-Leninism versus socially conservative Marxist-Leninism, or even MAGA communism, which also claims to be Marxist-Leninist. You know, patriotic socialism, as you like call them, patsies.
Yeah, that's my name for them.
What about this figure is so hollowed out that, like, it's not predictive of anyone's politics anymore?
I mean, on the one hand, I do think, you know, there's Stalin, for a lot of people who are on the left, you know, who are not Trotskyists or anarchists, etc., he's seen as like this someone who defended the Soviet Union, who defeated the Nazis, whether that, you know, and they uphold that, but then they just want to fill it in with all kinds of weird stuff to latch it on to what they do. And like, you know, you can see, like, I see like Maoists who, like, you know, if you're elected to office and you're a communist, you're actually no longer a communist, which, you know, I think even Stalin defended, you know, running communists in elections, you know, when they ran, like during the Popular Front period and other times. And other times, you know, but the thing is, you know, depending on the period of Stalin you're talking about, there was that early period of like Fitzpatrick talks about like the Cultural Revolution in the Soviet Union at the end of the 1920s, where it's very radical and there's these kind of assaults on privilege. So there's like a lot of experimentation in terms of literature, there's working class mobilization, et cetera. And you see, you know, the kind of quote unquote woke Marxist Leninists kind of maybe picking up on that for their progressivism. But by the late 40s, you see the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, which, let's be clear, that's pretty anti-Semitic and very great Russian nationalists. And this is like bringing the culmination of stuff that had been going on since the 30s of like reinstitution of like the patriarchal family, you know, all the authority structures. And the quote unquote, you know, the socially conservative Marxist Leninists, the patsies, they all pick up on that. And which I think makes sense because, you know, a lot of them are also very anti-Semitic. So in certain ways, they're kind of picking up on the aspects of Stalin that they kind of want. And they're maybe not looking at the wider totality of, you know, Stalin or Stalinism, which is understandable, but, you know, maybe it's just a bit one-sided how some of these people do it.
So it's interesting, and this is going to be controversial in our circles. Luckily, I'm not a monetized YouTuber. This would get pulled down. But there's also a tendency on the far right during the lead up to what we now call the alt-right for Stalin recuperationism on the far right. Mm-hmm. Kerry Bolton, Francis Jacqui before him. And I find it interesting, you know, a kind of resurgence in national Bolshevism, particularly in Russia, actually. Edward Lemonov, Alexander Dugin again. What I find interesting is, like, okay, some of those are obviously ridiculous, you know, people who get all weepy-eyed about the doctor's plot. And for those who don't know about what that is, you should look it up. But what I've noticed is there is a certain amount of like Stalinists who would consider themselves like post-left communist or something like that, or maybe even just communist, who actually have the same rhetoric as National Bolsheviks do on this stuff. And I remember, and I'm not going to say who told me this because I don't think they would want it said. This was about 10 years ago. I remember a friend of mine who was a Maoist, like a die-hard old school Maoist. Like, and he was like, one of the problems that I have with, quote, Maoism and anti-revisionism is that it has a tendency to become National Bolshevism, sometimes National Bolshevism of color, but in general, National Bolshevism. And when that happens, it takes on a reactionary character. And I find that interesting because that was a Maoist telling me this. It was not like some trot. You can't say it's just a trot, you know, Trotsky smearing us again. Do you think that's part of the appeal?
I think it is. So if you actually go all the way back to Winston Churchill, he actually praised Stalin in the Purges, saying, you know, it's the reassertion of nationalism of Russians over these internationalist Jews. And you kind of see that in a lot of people because that's part of, it may not be in the theory of socialism in one country, but it's definitely in the practice, this privileging of the nation of Russia or the Soviet Union, above the world revolution. And by the end of Stalin's life, it becomes incredibly, chauvinistic and nationalist, even if there's, still Marxist Leninist trappings there. And I think, like, if you take that just a few steps further, you get National Bolshevism. And you did see this particularly like in the late Soviet period. People who were coming up again, condemning Gorbachev, some of them were adopting a lot of this national Bolshevik rhetoric. They wanted to defend Stalin, not as a Marxist per se, but as like this great Russian leader and nationalist who brought us, glory and international fame. And it's obviously continued after the Soviet Union, because for a lot of, people of a certain age, in Russia, the Stalin era is like, there was order, there was stability, or at least that's what they believe. And there was the boss and everything, and we won the war. And there wasn't all this kind of radical experimentation after like 1936, it was ended. So there's this very socially conservative part of that. And again, you take that farther and you just shorn it of like a lot of the Marxist trappings, it's National Bolshevism. And you can kind of see, even Kotkin, it's interesting, he actually almost praises Stalin's dictatorship as like a work like Picasso, like a great work of art. It's this weird kind of like worship of power. And that's also, I think, part of the appeal of Stalin to right-wingers. Like, it's this very powerful person, even if it's not, I would reject the idea of totalitarianism, but Stalin is certainly this authoritarian figure. And that is something like right-wingers like that. And some of them are willing to look past the fact that he was a self-described Marxist and to adopt all of that.
I mean, I think we clearly see that in, say, Putin's speech, where he's condemning Lenin for the Ukraine situation, and yet takes a pretty soft line on Stalin for the Great Patriotic War, and I think you still see that in like undeniably right-wing Russian nationalism. And I do find that interesting, particularly given Stalin's a Georgian, and like his relationship to Russian nationalism is opportunistic, and he also suppressed it at earlier times. But around the purges and then definitely at the end of the war, it's just undeniable that he's playing that up. And it, I tend to have a soft spot on my heart for Khrushchev, but Khrushchev would also occasionally play it up. It was a constant problem in the USSR, this kind of tension between great Russian nationalism, even within the party, and, the internationalism of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Like, that was always a tension. It's less of a tension early on. In something that I've seen Stalinists misattribute to Trotsky. It'd been cool if Trotsky said it, but he didn't. It was that element of this that led someone like Bordiga to oppose Stalin. Like, Bordiga actually went up in Stalin's face during the Comintern when he was still the leader of the Communist Party of Italy. Because of Stalin's over-focus on the Warsaw Pact at the expense of communists making moves in the West. And this is an undeniable. I mean, people who know the history of Marxist-Leninist parties with official ties to the Soviet Union around the world is they actually tend to often be more conservative on their international and domestic politics, on statecraft issues than even the socialist parties tended to be. I mean, they're like in Chile, often Allende socialists, outflanked the communists on economic issues. Which
they also had like dual membership in the MIR, which is the Marxist group. So yeah. And Allende was on the right of the Socialist Party because he wanted a coalition with the communists.
Right. Which I think is something that people, today just have a hard time understanding. To get back to your book, though, when the Dialectics of Saturn, how did this right-wing anti-communism affect left-wing interpretations of the Soviet Union that, let's say, are serious. So, like, you mentioned the Frankfurt School, and what do you think the effect that it had, like the effect that this right-wing anti-communism had on like Frankfurt School thought?
I mean, partly is the fact they have to decide. The Frankfurt School is in a very interesting position, and it's kind of like that with Western Marxism in general. They don't quite adopt, they're not Stalinists, or at least not all of them, but they're not quite in opposition. So on the one hand, they want to have a place within like Western society. So they do adopt a lot of the language of totalitarianism, of, you know, the destructive power of reason, etc., that comes from a lot of anti-communists. And you see that like in people like, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer. And there is, but again, for them, they're also, depending on who we're talking about, they may be trying to adapt to, you know, trying to offer some kind of level of support. So it's interesting for like Adorno and Horkheimer, they are privately, for instance, very, like, they're horrified of the Soviet purges. They are like, I think like at one point, Adorno like gets really mad at Ernst Bloch, who is defending like the purging of Bukharin. But in public, they just defend the Soviet Union. So they think it's like their like duty to remain silent about their actual criticisms. You have someone like Ernst Bloch, you know, who is, you know, this great writer on utopia, on religion, etc. But he wants to write affidavits for the Moscow trials to like prove like that Trotsky is like a Nazi. As far as I know, the Soviet Union did not take him up on that offer. But the anti-communist stuff really gets solidified after World War II into a solid theory of totalitarianism. Before World War II, it's kind of like this, everyone is kind of using it. The Frankfurt School are using it, Trotsky's using it, Mussolini's using it, Franz Neumann, all these different people. But it's
I was reading Hal Draper threw the word around in 1947. He doesn't later, but like I was reading a Hal Draper essay where he's like, he talks about totalitarianism for a minute. And I was like, what? Like, that's weird. Like, go ahead.
But pretty much when you have, you know, totalitarianism kind of gets solidified after World War II into like an ideological weapon. I don't think it's ever useful to explain anything in the Soviet Union or elsewhere, but it gets solidified. And I don't think we quite understand, like, there really wasn't such a thing as Soviet studies in the United States before 1945. After 1945, you suddenly have the government and businesses funding all these research institutions, purging academia of anyone remotely critical. I mean, Stephen Cohen goes into this in one of his books, and it's just kind of incredible. And if you were to read like the level of discussion on Marxism that come from like prominent academics in like the 50s and early 60s, it's really bad. People like Adam Ulam, I'm like, anyone who's actually read Marx would know he's full of crap. But, you know, he's at Harvard, and he can do that because he's getting all the funding. People like Robert Conquest, Richard Pipes. So the people like the Frankfurt School are pretty much this beleaguered minority. And for one, you know, after World War II, a lot of them, or actually before World War II, a lot of them are in the West. And they actually have to, in some cases, they adapt some of like the language, you know, about, you know, totalitarianism.
Critical theory was also a code word for Marxism. Like, that's why they used it.
Yeah.
You couldn't say. But yeah, they adopted the language of totalitarianism. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. And so again, they're like just beleaguered and trying to survive, and you know, and you kind of see like by like the 60s, you have like they've really survived so much that they've just lost any pretense of being in opposition. Like Adorno refuses to support the students against Vietnam, and I know Marcuse calls him out on that. And Horkheimer goes even further, and he's supporting the Vietnam War.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, they're willing to make compromises, and you know, it may be understandable, but they, you know, a lot of them do succumb to like a lot of anti-communist moods on this. It also doesn't help that, especially Adorno and Horkheimer, just refuse to like get involved in any political action at all, even when things lighten up enough that is conceivable.
Yeah, that's an interesting complication of this that I often think a lot about. I mean, Marcuse's relationship to Stalinism is actually unclear to me, and I don't say that because I haven't studied him. Studying him makes it more unclear. And you have someone like Henrik Grossman, or in addition to Bloch. Well, Grossman decides after. It's actually kind of weird. Grossman decides to be supportive of the Soviet Union after 1936.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then, you know, I always point out he goes to West Germany and immediately dies there. I mean, not West Germany, East Germany. He's the only Frankfurt School member who goes to the East after the war. And from what I understand, he immediately regrets it, and he then dies. But
yeah, what's interesting about Grossman is he's one of the very unique people in the Frankfurt School. He had a long history of activism before World War I. He was in like the Polish social democracy, the Bund groups.
Yeah, and he had ties to Austro-Marxism too.
Yeah, and he was in, I think he was a founding member of the Polish Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only reason he wasn't active, because he moved to Germany at one point, it was just like kind of a condition for him staying, but he kind of always maintained that pro-Soviet position. And I know it eventually got like him into hot water with Adorno and Horkheimer. Because, you know, I think he was eventually kicked out of the Frankfurt School over that.
Yeah, he was called, well, it's not explicitly over that. The letter actually just calls him a positivist, okay. But they call him a positive pretty much for that reason. So, but I mean, one of the things about the Frankfurt School, and this is one of my arguments against people who see the whole thing as a conspiracy, despite also often having the timeline wrong. But there was overlap between the U.S. State Department and intelligence agencies in the Frankfurt School, absolutely. And three of them, although not Horkheimer or Adorno, explicitly did work for the OSS. However, they worked for the OSS under anti-Nazi grounds. So
Marcuse, Newman, I forget who else.
Newman, and there's a third one whose name has totally left me too. But yeah.
Yeah, and Marcuse was unapologetic about that. I actually talk a little about an interview he gives in like the 60s. It's like, yeah, it was because of World War II. But he actually continues working for like both the OSS and the State Department into the 50s. And he actually doesn't get purged over McCarthyism. He just goes back to the university. And it was just kind of interesting about that. And Newman's wrote that wonderful book called Behemoth, which is one of my favorite books on the Third Reich. But I think that was pretty much written for the OSS. And it was certainly praised in like mainstream journals when it was released.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting also to try, you know, I think a lot of the stuff about the Frankfurt School and the OSS, which is very real, we also have to remember the United States was technically allied with the Soviet Union when it happened. Does that mean there wasn't anti-communist stuff going on? Of course not. There was, but it's a very complicated situation. I think you actually are right that Marcuse is not getting purged during this, you know, doing HUAC and whatnot is actually kind of interesting. And I guess probably the birthplace of a lot of conspiracy theories, some of which might not be totally illegitimate. But I do think we have to look at that. And I also think we have to look at people like Sidney Hook and people who were like Trotskyist defectors. Who you know, James Burnham, because, you know, like, you know, James Burnham, whose managerial classes like thesis is basically right-wing bureaucratic collectivism, like the thesis, and people miss this, but if you actually read him, his argument is if we can't beat them, just join them and have the managerial class come out of the military.
Also interesting is it's very influential on George Orwell's development of 1984. He takes
absolutely, Absolutely. I remember when I read the managerial class. What's interesting about Orwell, okay, because Orwell is a figure that like plagues me. Orwell writes a bunch of critiques of Burnham in the 30s and 40s, but by the time you get to 1984, Goldstein, who was clearly supposed to be Trotsky, is spouting Burnham, not Trotskyist understandings of the Soviet Union. And that's wild to me, because if you read the New Machiavellians, you realize that Burnham just thinks the only way to beat Nazi managers is to have better American managers who are pretty much the same thing. Like, it's just a wild bit. But you're right, it's all over 1984, and it's given our feelings about who Trotsky turned over to the British intelligence services. I think Deutscher was one of them.
Yeah, he gave a lot of names. And the thing is, I've heard that defended, well, they were all known, but it's like, let's say that's true. It's like, what does it say if someone's willing to give names over the police? And Orwell's explicit in some of his letters that, if war came between Russia and the US, he was on the side of the US. People who's trying to make him out to be this kind of principled, revolutionary or socialist, I think, are kind of missing the mark about where this guy was. I think there was this brief period after the Spanish Civil War where he was trying to be some kind of revolutionary leftist, not a Marxist, but still some kind of revolutionary. By World War II, that's pretty much gone. He has some idiosyncratic ideas on his own patriotic socialism, I might add, if you read like The Lion and the Unicorn, which is a bizarre work.
Yeah, The Lion and the Unicorn are his second refutation. The Burnham is basically Burnham's run. Like, one of his arguments against James Burnham and the managerial class is like, literally, Burnham doesn't understand a good working class like the English working class. And I'm like, that's your answer? Wow. Like, just like, oh, so you think that the English working class isn't capable of being politically retrograde because they're English? Okay, Orwell. Like, yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I do admire Orwell of the 30s to some degree, even though I think he's a dilettante. But the Orwell of the 40s is, I think if he had lived, he would have been a James Burnham. And if you know where James Burnham ends up, like, I mean, Burnham is one of the people who co-founds the Congress of Cultural Freedom, but he's also, like, if you read his post New Machiavellians work, he's a reactionary by the end of his life, even by the standards of people in the OSS.
Oh, he's defending apartheid South Africa. I don't think he thought the Sino-Soviet split was real. He was a co-founder of National Review.
Right.
No, I agree about Orwell there. And it's actually one of the points in my book is Orwell's is very good at describing things like situations. Like if you read like Road to Wigan Pier or like Homage to Catalonia, it's very good on like a lot of descriptions. It's very good to read. But if you're looking like something deeper, like how it works, it really doesn't do that for me. He really doesn't. And he's actually very disdainful of any kind of revolutionary theories. Like, they kind of just know it, but he never kind of gets, but he still thinks we need a party and all of this. He just thinks like people, it's just justice and the common decency and all this. You don't need dialectics or any of that.
No, in fact, I mean, he openly mocks a lot of that.
Yes.
So, Orwell's in one of these figures that with Koestler. Koestler's interesting because, like I told you, I end up putting him on the right, but barely, and it was a real hard call if I had to. Like, he's a mixed figure, unlike someone like Whittaker Chambers. Chambers is clearly a right-wing figure. However, interestingly, in my opinion, he could have been prevented. But I don't want to get too much into that because I actually have a whole thing that I call the Whittaker Chambers problem, which is where someone outs something legitimate a legitimate criticism of something on the left, and then they get mocked, and then they double down and start making shit up and run to the right, which I think is what happened with Chambers. And I always call it a problem because I see it as a dialectical problem where both sides are contributing to the situation. So what other like left semi anti-communist figures do you find interesting? Deutscher's interesting to me because I remember when I was in a certain society, they used to call him Stalinophilic as opposed to Tony Cliff, who they called Stalinophobic. And I was like, is Deutscher Stalinophilic? I just think he's trying to be fair. Like,
I mean, I argue that part of the last part of the book is that from Trotskyism, you have like two kind of deviations. One is what I call like the Eastern reconciliation, which is Deutscher. On the one hand, he is like a very good scholar on Trotsky, on Stalin, on Soviet studies, etc. But it's very clear he is looking for like reform of like the Eastern Bloc, and he has like a soft spot for Mao in like the 50s and until the Cultural Revolution. So he kind of gives up on, you know, what Trotsky was arguing for in terms of like, you know, the political revolution. And he's looking more for like bureaucratic reform. In that sense, he is, but it's like, and there is a line from him to someone like Marcy and like these really kind of Stalinoid figures, but he's not quite the same because at the same time, he is defending like a lot of Eastern Bloc dissidents at times. He doesn't defend the Hungarian Revolution, but he defends like a lot of these Polish Marxists who are in opposition. So in that sense, yeah, he is kind of, and he does kind of see Stalin as like historically necessary, but he thinks like Stalinism has played its part in modernizing Russia, therefore we should reform it and finally have socialist democracy. And, you know, that obviously, there was like a whole school of like Deutscher, like people like, you know, the New Left Review kind of came out of that. David Horowitz, when he actually had a working brain, was a student of Deutscher, and, you know.
And a Maoist.
And a Maoist.
Like, which is, yeah, Horowitz is one of the people I bring up and people go, it's all the Trotskyists who become neoconservatives. Like, Horowitz was a Maoist. Just want to point that out. Like, it's not just Trotskyists. Also, France. Go look at France.
Oh, yeah.
Like, go see how many, like...
the new philosophers. There's something else.
Yeah.
Someone else I did find interesting. It was what I called the Western Retreat. And there's obviously figures like, you know, Shachtman and Burnham, who were former Trots who go to like the far right. The person I was looking at, he doesn't quite go that full distance, but it's clear that's his trajectory by the end of his life, is Victor Serge, who was a former anarchist, Bolshevik, and left oppositionist. But after Trotsky died, he's pretty much a left-wing social democrat, because he is adopting a lot of these a lot of Burnham's ideas on the managerial society. He's very apprehensive about the move of the Red Army into Eastern Europe and the various partisan movements in Western Europe. And he condemns Mao, Tito, Ho Chi Minh, all these figures as like agents of Soviet totalitarianism. And he's even coming out for de Gaulle shortly before he dies. So his transition is not complete, and it's also kind of, he has a lifelong nostalgia for the Bolshevik Revolution, because he writes like a 30-year retrospective about 2 weeks before he dies about this, you know, how great the Bolsheviks were. And in that sense, he's kind of like, you know, Christopher Hitchens, who always had a soft spot for Trotsky, but was defending the Iraq War and things like that. So Serge is kind of like that figure who's moving towards the West. He isn't quite there yet, but I think if you look at his like late notebooks and stuff, he's clearly on that trajectory. But he's kind of interesting in like how he's trying to articulate all that. And he's kind of like an unfinished project. And that's kind of like why I find him interesting. Unlike Shachtman, who just kind of, it's a much slower process, and he tries to make himself more coherent, like in terms of his ideas on like bureaucratic collectivism, than I think actually existed. Serge is also just a talented writer, you know, who can actually like lyrically express like his ideas. And that's also true of Deutscher as well. But those two figures are very interesting to me, just like how they, ended up as like these two trajectories from Trotsky's ideas in different directions.
Yeah, Deutscher and Shachtman, and in the British context. Actually, I don't know the reconciliationists in the British context. I also think it's maybe Deutscher, but like Tony Cliff is clearly has a similar trajectory to Shachtman. Doesn't end up going as far right, but Shatman's right wingness is, you know, towards the end of his life is actually something of a debate. But I tend to side with you. He goes like he's not quite a neoconservative, but it's the reason why a lot of people associated with him didn't take that long to get there.
Yeah, I mean, he's endorsing Nixon before he dies. That's pretty.
That's pretty bad.
And you know, you brought up Sidney Hook, and he's interesting because he kind of broke from like the revolutionary left before World War II.
He broke in 1938.
Yeah,
like,
and I don't think he was technically a Trotskyist, but he was certainly in that orbit.
He was.
I know he's part of the Workers' Party.
Right,
that,
he's part of the Workers' Party,
etc. Were part of, but he kind of left like organized like Marxist politics after that.
Yeah, he was mostly a theorist. I mean, it's a shame, as I commented to you on Facebook once. His pre-1938 Marx scholarship was actually really good. So
I'm actually a huge fan of his book From Hegel to Marx. I've read it twice. I really like it.
But
and he had got a lot of his Marxism from Lukács and Korsch, which is kind of really unique among Americans at that point.
Oh yeah. One of the things that's interesting about him, though, is like, so we talk about the Congress of Cultural Freedom and with their successor organization that was all over Europe in the 50s. I can't remember their name, but
was that it?
Yeah, Encounter. They have a bunch of different
journal. I don't know if that was the organization.
No, there was an organization because they were like holding conferences. I mean, one of the things is like Christopher Lasch. One of the good things he did was out that.
That's some of my favorite writings of his.
Yeah, I mean, he just like in World of Nations, he's just like, yeah, these guys are probably working for the CIA. And like, that's not confirmed until the 80s. Like, but yeah, I mean, but Hook is interesting because he's basically the left, the liberal left face of that. Because Burnham becomes more and more reactionary, but Hook kind of stays a good liberal Democrat with some couple of socialistic-ish ideas. And I think that's like how they captured that whole milieu, because if you're not a neoconservative but you're still connected to that post-partisan review milieu with Encounter and Commentary and all that, MacDonald and Trilling and those guys are also anti-communist, but they don't have the whiff of reaction about them. So I think that's an interesting problem. And Hook's kind of their prototypical model. Like,
yeah, I mean, Hook is interesting in the sense, like, as far as I know, he still described himself as a revisionist Marxist anyway until he died. I think he was still part of Social Democrats USA.
Yeah, I believe he considered himself like a Bernsteinist.
Yeah, because actually one of my editions of Evolutionary Socialism has like a foreword by him in it. And I also think he considered himself an atheist, which a lot of these people like return to religion of some sort. And, you know, he was a non-believer and etc. Although he didn't allow his earlier Marxist, you know, like from the 30s work, at least towards the understanding of Karl Marx, to be reprinted. As far as I know, like From Hegel to Marx was still in print even after he turned. And I know he did an anthology in like the 60s, like Marx and the Marxists, which has this kind of like crappy commentary, but it still puts a lot of, you know, Marxian thinkers out there.
So I guess, what are the other interesting left-wing anti-Stalinists who flirt with this anti-communist agenda?
I mean, there's one figure, at least in part of his life, who was kind of doing this, was Francois Furet. Because he was originally in the French Communist Party. And after he left, he actually, for about 10 years, was in various kind of like left socialist movements in France. I think he was part of the PSU. the Unified Socialist Party. And obviously part of his big break with Marxism is like his whole critique of the French Revolution and like the revisionist school. And he's like really challenging like a lot of like the what I call the Jacobin Marxist orthodoxy on it that is defended by the French Communist Party. So in that sense, he is, someone who comes out of like the organized Communist Party, and at least for a few years tries to maintain some kind of independent leftist position, but moves over to becoming one of the Dizians of like anti-communism. And he was very influential on the new philosophers, because they were obviously arguing that the Gulag is the end result of Bolshevism. And he's saying, well, revolutions always end in slaughter. Just look at the French Revolution, look at my work. And he, he just makes it like basically the Jacobins killed people just for the sake of killing people, just like the Bolsheviks, just like Pol Pot and all of this. And, that was like music to a lot of ears of a lot of these former Maoists. I actually just finished reading Bernard Henry Levy's book, Barbarism with a New Face, which was definitely the worst book I've read this year. It's very facile. It's very superficial, but, it's, bringing up a lot of like, the Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, etc. But, he's part of that milieu that was listening to people like Fauré and Solzhenitsyn. And it's interesting, actually, at one point, Solzhenitsyn was, at least in the 30s and part of the 40s, he considered himself a Marxist and a socialist, albeit an anti-communist or an anti-Stalinist one. He actually was doing independent reading of like Hegel and Marx during the purges. Yeah. And obviously he had a return to religion.
Oh yeah, I mean he was a right-wing for a Russian Orthodox reactionary by the end of his life.
Yes, he was. Obviously, and an anti-Semite. People forget that he really liked the whites and everything.
I mean, I remember talking about like, I mean, his anti-Semitism is interesting in the sense that it wasn't racial, but
that's what Richard Pipes says. I'm not quite convinced that that's the case, but yeah.
Well, I don't just get it from Richard Pipes. I mean, I get it from his own writing. But to me, that's irrelevant. Like Mussolini's anti-Semitism was also not racist. Was also not racial. And he was a big pusher of Judeo-Bolshevik talk towards the end of his life. I mean, that's, like one of his big pieces is like, well, if the Jews remain good Jews, they'd be okay, but they didn't remain good Jews and they became communist, and then see what happened. And, I'm like, oh yeah, Judeo-Bolshevik talk, which I don't think people know about it now from Breitbart, but I used to be on the right. Like, and I remember being shocked when I was even as a right-winger discovering that was common in the late 90s and early aughts in the paleo-conservative right, was like Joe Sobran was still writing articles about Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy stuff, like, in 2004. So it had an influence. But yeah, I remember reading about Solzhenitsyn being kind of an independent socialist. It makes me wonder about people like Kolakowski.
That's another one. Yeah, he's also kind of like Fauré, because he joined the Polish Communist Party for not career advancement. He genuinely believed in it, and he was excited by the '56, reform movement. But by like the late '60s, it kind of had fizzled, and there had been like these kind of vicious anti-Semitic campaigns in Poland. He abandoned Marxism, and he writes like his magnum opus, The Main Currents of Marxism, which I think is actually very Catholic and religious in a lot of its understanding of Marxism. He calls it like one of the greatest fantasies of the 20th century. And,
he traces it all the back, like people forget this, but he starts The Main Currents of Marxism with Plotinus.
Oh yeah. He goes all the way back.
Like it's like, oh, so like you're basically saying communism is a Marxist conspiracy. I mean, although interestingly, what I find interesting about that is when he wrote that, theoretically, he was still actually a Marxist. So, I mean, so I find our communist, not just a Marxist. So I find that quite fascinating. But I also remember him, you know, trying to being like Sidney Hook and trying to have his cake and eat it too, towards the end of his life on his positions on all sorts of stuff. Like, oh, I'm a socialist, but I'm not a communist, and I'm a nationalist, but I'm not a like. There's some stuff from like 89, 90 that is kind of ridiculous. And then his debates with E.P. Thompson are, you know, Thompson spanks him, but
yes, he does.
But yeah, I find this very, very interesting to me. And I also find like how the left opposition is characterized in the United States. It is favored in a way that it's actually weirdly anti-communist. Like, and I think that is part of, you know, we were talking about earlier, my kind of despair about the rebirth of a particularly hollow form of Marxist Leninism. I mean, I think part of it comes from that, and the fact that so much of this material, even when it was Soviet defensists or had very complicated views on the Soviet Union, has been recuperated for anti-communism through most of the second half of the 20th century. So, you know, and it is also true. You have figures like Horkheimer and Serge, who it's very hard to tell, you know, where they're actually at politically, but it seems increasingly, you know, towards anti-communism.
Yes.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about, like specifically about you know, your book that we haven't touched on?
I guess the one thing I would touch on is originally the book was supposed to be like an expose on Domenico Lacerda's Stalin book, which ended up just being the appendix. Because he's obviously comes out of a Western Marxist tradition. He's also was part of like organized like Italian communist movements as well. I think he's done a lot of valuable scholarship. His Stalin stuff, not so much. It's actually quite bad. And I tried to go through his various writings, particularly the Stalin history and critique of a Black legend, where it's, you know, Grover Furrish and, you know, his views on like the purges.
He's more, to me, I have read a bootleg translation of the book.
Yeah, that's the one I read too, probably.
And I was like, it's Grover Furrish, but it's also weirdly not. And like,
it's more sophisticated than that.
It's way more sophisticated than that. Yeah, like
because, you know, he does this. He like both of them praise each other, but
yeah.
You know, the thing is, like, again, I find a lot of Lacerda's other scholarship very valuable, but his Stalin stuff, if we're doing a balance sheet, that is definitely on the negative side.
I don't like his Hegel and Philosophy of Right book either. But
I haven't read that one. I did actually enjoy the Freedom of the Moderns book.
Yeah, and I think I'm more mixed with you on his book on Nietzsche, but
we'll say that for another time.
That's a whole different debate.
But it's also part of the reason I included the Lacerda appendix is he's actually the one who coined the specific phrase "dialectic of Saturn" in the Stalin book, so it kind of made sense to actually talk about him per se.
Yeah, I was that. Did you? I think at one point I saw what probably became the appendix as an article somewhere, because I remember you doing a review of not just the errors, but the errors other Italian scholars had called out in that book. The Stalin and the Black Legend book. I remember like a whole lot of like scholars in Italy had called out how sloppy that scholarship was. It wasn't.
I didn't read too much of the Italian stuff. There was some French stuff I did read that was translated. I think it was like Jean-Marie someone.
Mm-hmm.
But I think mine is, you know, at least in English, I think it's like the only extensive like look at Lacerda's Stalin.
Well, I'm glad you published it.
Thank you.
And I think it's, I mean, I don't want the critique of Stalinism and the understanding of Stalin to be left to me to like simple anti-communist or even frankly like partisan Trotskyists from the 60s. Like I do think we have to do better than that. And I do think we also have to try to understand him like I told you, organizing this around Brumaire, I have always understood Stalin as a Bonapartist figure, and I've also accepted the kind of Deutscher take that Trotsky may not have been as brutal of a Bonapartist figure, but had he won the political battle, he probably would have also been a Bonapartist figure. And I think it's Deutscher where I got the attribution that Trotsky actually even admitted to that at the end of his life. So that, that's sort of my reading. And I do sort of think that the Trotskyist Maoist hostility, because some of that I think has to do with the fact that they were competing forms of alternative Marxist-Leninism. I know that Trotskyists wouldn't say they were Marxist-Leninists; they call themselves Leninists, but like they were competing forms of like Leninist understanding of the USSR, and particularly at a time when leftists in general didn't have particularly great or even strong interest in political economy. Weirdly, the 60s and 70s. Led them to be hostile to each other for both historical reasons. I mean, I mentioned Chen Duji, who was, pretty much written out of the history by Mao because of his quote Trotskyism unquote. But there's also the fact that they were like the new communist movement, for example, was divided amongst tons of Trotskyist and Maoist groups over really tiny splits. And I do think that also is a historical tragedy because it means that there was no robust, large-scale grouping that could have had these debates with each other within a standpoint of like having a unified political project. And part of that was obscured by the fact that they were also attached to actually existing states, are opposing those actually existing states. But it is sort of a real kind of historical missed opportunity that I think plays out through the rest of the 20th century and into now as a missed opportunity. I don't know how you feel about that, but it does seem that way to me. Like there are things that Trotskyists and Maoists could have learned from each other in their mutual critiques of elements of the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, that would have allowed for a whole lot of other developments to happen. And between sectarian hostilities and then the Sino-Soviet split, that is simply impossible.
I mean, I that's an interesting point to make. I think there was this kind of I mentioned people like Bettelheim earlier. There was this interesting point, even though Mao and the Sino-Soviet split was taking up the defense of Stalin, there was this attempt, at least among the more sophisticated ones, to try and develop a more robust Maoist critique of the Soviet Union and what had gone wrong. And on the one hand, I do think the Maoists probably could have learned a bit from Trotsky, etc. I also think, and I've had Maoists say this, like a lot of Trotskyists don't read Mao and, understand like the dynamics of the Chinese Revolution, etc. And I think, yeah, it's actually, if you're going to actually criticize Mao or, defend what you want, it's actually important to read and understand these people. And yeah, I always think more reading is good, and certainly having comradely dialogue, although a lot of like the Maoist groups of that period were very viscerally anti-Trotskyist and very dogmatic. Not to say a lot of the Trotskyist groups weren't very dogmatic themselves, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, for my big thing is, for example, is like there's a lot of stuff that Trotsky has historically wanted that the Great Proletarian Social Revolution actually did. Like, and then Maoists themselves, like, now don't really play that up, but it is actually an interesting dilemma to try to look at.
I actually like things like the Shanghai Commune, like the Sheng Wulan, and some of like the other more radical Red Guards. I'd actually agree with you on that. Those are actually like, I think in some level, you know, in Trotsky's language, is like incipient political revolution, if you want to put it like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Last question, and you might be invited on a panel about this, just to tell you in the future, okay. Because I'm running a bunch of them. I know I'm running one on the legacy and seeming demise of Western Trotskyism, and I would like your input as a Trotsky sympathetic person. But and I might try to do one on the demise of Cultural Revolution, Maoism, and the West too. But that's it's harder to get people to talk about that.
I know some people you might want to talk to actually about that. I don't know if you're friends with Drew Smith on Twitter.
I'm not, but I could be.
He's someone I would look up. He's originally from Georgia. He's a Maoist historian. He's a good friend of mine, and he's currently teaching in China, but I think he would definitely be interested. He runs like his own Cultural Revolution podcast. So
yeah, I have I was at one time interested in the Matt Rothwell, the guy who does the People's History of Ideas, which is basically I think a really good and historically responsible like intellectual defense and actually an eminent critique of Maoism and its development. And I've learned a ton from it. I reached out to him and we tried to actually have to do an episode, like he agreed to it, and then it got scuttled and we haven't had a chance to reschedule it. But because I asked him what he thought about China after 1978, he was like, really? Like, yeah, you know.
As far as I know, Drew still considers himself an orthodox Maoist, but he's fine talking to me. So I think he would be, and you know, he's fairly honest. So yeah.
Yeah, I might be reaching out to that because I want people to be able to talk about it, and I don't want anyone to get in trouble with their sectarian organization for doing it.
Sure.
So you know, it's a thing. That's also kind of been a problem with the Trotskyist debate. I feel like I'm overrepresenting former ISO people because because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
And B, like they don't have an org they have to answer to anymore. I mean, unless it's one of the caucuses in the DSA. But so yeah, I this will probably be offered to you. But on that note, though, just and quick, why do you think just in like 5 minutes, Trotskyism has been so flat-footed in response to this current situation? Do you think it's just too many of them hitch-dragging with the Social Democrats, or what?
I really think there was like a hitching to the Social Democrats. I actually said on my Facebook at one point, like 2016 and 2020 were basically American Trotskyism's Jesse Jackson moment, you know, which is like what led to the decline of American Maoism, was like all these Maoist groups going to like this like reformist campaign in the Democratic Party. And a lot of them just refused to develop a revolutionary perspective or abandon one to kind of get involved in this. And some of them, like the ISO, I think was very opportunistic. And it really didn't take much of a leap for a lot of those people to join DSA and become pretty much the far right of DSA. And again, I think part of that is DSA kind of like sucked the air out of the room a lot of these groups wanted, and they just wanted to hitch on to that, and they were willing to shed things on that.
Yeah.
And
I kind of feel the same. I mean, you know who's felt more and more prophetic on this, even though I don't know what his current politics are. But Charlie Post, like, warning about a popular front, even if led by social democrats, will probably still end up being the same thing. So, and it does seem like a whole lot of Trotskyists were willing to drop the United Front thing for the Popular Front thing in the DSA. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's part of it. I don't think that can explain all of it, because the decline has been somewhat global. And I do occasionally have my whole, like, Mike McNair, you know, there's a little bit of that paragraph in Revolutionary Strategy when he goes, like, all the Trotskyist organizations predicted a way that the Soviet Union might change or die, and all of them were wrong. And I was like, oh God, yeah, that does kind of hurt. But they didn't kill Trotskyism, actually. It's this most recent stuff that did. So it's something I think a lot about. So yeah, I might have you, just so you know, I might invite you to a panel on that topic, because I know you care about it, and I would like to give your opinion. And I think you've given me a good bit of it. Social democracy. That's another thing, Doug, is I also can't always tell social democrats from Marxist Leninists anymore, other than aesthetically.
Well, that was true back in the Popular Front, and it's true kind of today. Really, what was the difference between the Communist Party of the USA in, like, 1937 and, like, Social Democrats, beyond maybe the lingering rhetoric? And it's kind of true today, because a lot of the, you know, I don't like using a lot of the Hal Draperisms, but there is that kind of socialism from above. You know, the Social Democrats are looking for electoral reforms and savior politicians, and the Marxist Leninists are looking for, like, the strong man. And there you can kind of see the overlap there. They may put, like, different rhetoric and aesthetics on it, but yeah, it's not a lot of faith in the working class, I have to say.
I think we'll also be introduced to, and talk to you someday about Hal Draper, because Draper is the only Shachtmanite I like.
I like aspects of him. A lot of his Marx scholarship I really love, but a lot of his other politics I'm not a big fan of.
Yeah.
But to his credit, he did oppose Shachtman on Cuba, and I actually give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, if people's politics are often quite strange. I mean, one of the other weirdo collaborations of the 20th century was Paul Maddock, the council communist, being good friends with and a promoter of Heinrich Grossman.
Well, they had similar views on Marxian economics, I'd say.
Yeah, they did.
Both of them for the same reason.
Yeah, they did. They had opposed views on Stalin and trade.
That's true. They did.
Although, again, Maddock took a good stance on Cuba.
He did, and, you know, I really like Maddock. I recently read his work, Marx and Keynes. I was, like, very impressed with that.
Yeah, that's a great book. I've been trying to get people I'm like, don't let the Keynesians fool you.
Like, I want to give that to all my monthly review friends. I'm like, read this. This is pretty good.
Oh, I always forget that monthly review somehow involved Hal Draper.
Yeah, they're the ones who published the Marx series.
Right.
Well, there's a funny thing, like Paul Sweezy writes a blurb on the back of the first volume praising it. But if you actually read Draper's Two Souls of Socialism, he pretty much calls out, like, Sweezy as a Stalinist. So I think it's actually to Sweezy's credit that he kind of overlooked that and just, like, you know what? Draper, he did the good scholarship up. I'm just going to ignore the rest of that.
Well, I mean, one of the places in the 70s and 80s where there was interchange between between Trotskyist, other Marxist, and Maoist was actually the monthly review.
That's true.
Not true anymore, but it was definitely true in the 70s and 80s.
I mean, even when you're right, when they're publishing all the stuff on the Cultural Revolution, they're publishing Ernst Mandel, etc. Right.
Yeah, the publishing Ernst Mandel, they're working with, like, Ellen Merkins Woods was an editor, I believe. Yeah. So, like, post Trotsky, I think, do we consider political Marxists Trotskyist?
Some of them.
All right.
Some of them at least would consider themselves Trotskyists, let's put it like that.
Yeah, okay. I remember the Neil Davidson versus Ellen Woods debates, and I'm like, wait, who was Trot? They both were Trots? I don't remember.
I don't know if Woods considered himself a Trotskyist. Davidson definitely did, at least of like the Tony Cliff type school.
Yeah, he was, although he was far more orthodox than most of the Cliffites. But anyway, we're getting into Trotskyist sectariana, which I get into too much. And if you're not a real Marx nerd, you don't care. So we're going to end this here. I would strongly suggest people check out your book. Not to out you because I want your book to be a good seller, but it is from an academic press, so it's expensive.
It is. I would just suggest people ask your library to order it, review it, and write nice letters to the publisher asking for a paperback to make that a possibility.
Yeah, let's ask for one of those. Who published it?
Roman Littlefield.
Oh yeah, we're not as likely to get, like, Brill has that cool deal with Haymarket where they'll like put all the historical materialism stuff on the only kind of expensive side of things, as opposed to the, oh my God, only a library can buy this side of things. But yeah, ask for it from your library, because that's really what the audience are aiming for, and that would help Doug out, and it would also get you to read the book. So thank you so much for coming on. Anything else you'd like to plug?
I just completed a book on Kowskyism, so hopefully.
Ooh, you picking a fight?
Yes, I'm definitely picking a fight. Yeah, why not? I'm just going whole hog on all this stuff.
You picked a fight with the Harringtonites and picked a fight with the Stalinists. Now you're going to pick a fight with the. I'm going to actually ask you this question as you're now writing a book on Kowskyism. I don't know what Neo Kowskyism is anymore, because some Neo Kowskyism is like Lars Lee Leninism, with some Mike McNair thrown in, and some stuff about with Quentin Skinner and like socialist republicanism or something. Some of it is what I like to call the Bashkar-Sankara esoteric Austro-Marxism, exoteric social democracy. And some of it is whatever Eric LeBlanc is doing.
Yeah.
And are like Stefan Hommel, who I really like, but has some strange opinions on Lenin. So, like, what even is it?
It's an interest. I mean, to start with, Lars Lee he's just kind of like opening the door for like this revival. And I don't think he really has any nefarious agenda, because he's just an academic. That's not to condemn him. It's just what he is. And he basically makes Lenin into a Kautskyite. And I have a lot of problems with that interpretation. I'll just stop there. But I think, the big, like Blanc is one of the big ones. And he's definitely trying this right kind of Neo-Kowskyism. But it's very amorphous what he's proposing. And it ultimately is just back Joe Biden. I think Mike McNair is trying for a more left version, but I think he is kind of reproducing a lot of like the same gradualism, even if there's like a more emphasis on like Marxian republicanism or etc.
Yeah, this was my feeling, because I was like, okay, Blanc has read Revolutionary Strategy by McNair, as has Bashkar-Sankara, and did they ignore all the parts about not siding with the socialist right? Like, are like. Yes. The right, it's just right. It's just have to ignore it. But then, when I look at the strategy by like the Lenin-Kautsky hybrid people, like large parts of Cosmonaut magazine, for example, and this is not to shit on Cosmonaut. I like a lot of them.
I like a lot of them too.
And I like a lot of them personally.
Yeah,
but I'm like, so you're what you're trying to do is take over the same thing run by the you know, these Blancist, for lack of a better word, or Sankaraist style social democrats, but you still actually ultimately don't have you're not actually that interested in reviving working class institutions to do it. In fact, they kind of get mad about that when you just point out well, DSA is a left institution, and what are you going to merge with? Like, how does this merger formula work when there's nothing to merge with? And I don't know. I think it's an interesting debate to have. My opinion of them probably won't make you happy, but I kind of feel like they're reinventing some of the elements of, say, like third campus Trotskyism, but without the virtues of Trotsky.
That's an interesting take. I thought they were definitely more on like the McNair side, because I've seen a lot of talk among them on like Republicanism. I think they're proposing some DSA resolution on like having a democratic constitution for the U.S. or something.
Yeah, I find it very interesting, and I don't mean this to be cruel to my friends, but like, you can't win a full revision of the DSA's constitution, but you're having a plank to rewrite the United States as one.
That's a good point.
Like, I don't know, man. I mean, maybe as agitprop, I guess, but I also have a hard time seeing like most of the DSA signing on to that. Like,
I don't see it happening. I also don't know like what that would actually involve. I mean, they're saying like the US has never been like a democratic republic. Okay, I mean, we know it's like a bourgeois democracy, it's very curtailed, but I don't know. I just don't find the argument like to fight for that very convincing.
Well, I mean, it just also feels like if you're going to overthrow the Constitution, you might as well just say what you are.
Yeah.
It's just like we're going to democratically rewrite the entirety of U.S. law. Like, okay, cool. Anyway, this is off topic and dangerously close to throwing shade, but amongst comrades, we do have to talk about these things somewhat honestly, and that's an interesting one. And on that note, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for giving me 2 hours of your time, and people should definitely write your library so that they buy the book and it's available to the public.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.